All right. So just a quick introduction. Most Policy Initiative is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and our goal is really to connect science to policy in Missouri. We are helping Missourians find and interpret research information so that they can make better decisions and better understand their communities and their government. And so that's about all I'm going to say about that. We are also proudly co-sponsored by the Missouri Local Science Engagement Network, which is a partnership with AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And so with that, I'm going to introduce Zach Miller, and then Zach's going to introduce the rest of his team. Zach is a PhD candidate at the University of Missouri, very soon to be a PhD. He's going to defend in a few weeks here. And Zach works in the Division of Biological Sciences. Zach also, we're really excited. Zach was the very first graduate policy fellow here at MOST. So he joined our team in about January to help with this project and some other work. And we're also very excited to announce that Zach is going to be permanently joining our team in August as our program coordinator. So very, very happy to have him here. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Zach. And Zach, you can introduce the rest of your team.
Sure. Thank you so much for the introduction. This project was a lot of fun. I couldn't have done it without these other folks that are here with me. So I'll start out. If you guys could just each say your name, where you're coming from, and what your research is focused on. And we'll start out with Caleb.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Caleb O'Brien. I'm a Missouri native, but currently a PhD candidate at Virginia Tech. And my work focuses on informal science learning in specifically around climate change adaptation in the United States. So this project was very much in my wheelhouse, so I was excited to work with Zach on it.
My name's Casey Canfield. I'm an assistant professor in engineering management and systems engineering at Missouri S&T in Rolla. My research is really about how to quantify the human part of systems. And so I look at lots of stuff like energy and broadband and healthcare, really thinking about the human part of the system.
And I'm Lauren Sullivan. I'm an assistant professor at University of Missouri in the Biological Sciences Department. And I study prairies. I do a lot of prairie ecology, but this week I'm actually doing some forest ecology in Van Buren, Missouri in the Current River watershed. So enjoying some beautiful Missouri.
Cool. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to share my screen here. Everybody can see the screen.
Looks good.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much for coming. It is a real pleasure to see so many people interested in this topic. And just to give you guys a little bit of background on this, I am also a Missouri native. I've been here my whole life. I grew up south of St. Louis in Jefferson County, in a pretty rural area. I recently purchased a house in a rural area. So this rural is going to be the focus of our conversation today. I just bought a house in Wooldridge, Missouri, which is about 35 minutes southwest of Columbia. And the picture that you're looking at here is a picture I took during a jog a couple weeks ago. It was just a really nice day. And so that's the landscape that we are talking about. I care about Missouri a lot. As an ecologist and a biologist, I think a lot about our natural resources. My background and the focus of my research at the University of Missouri is in trying to understand how ecosystem services, so things like pollination, regulation my work focuses on pollination, but I'm broadly interested in all ecosystem services like nitrogen fixation or carbon mitigation and sequestration. And so I'm really fascinated and interested in like landscape scale kinds of questions, like what kinds of decisions do we make at a landscape scale? And what does that mean for the businesses that are on the ground, for the plants and animals that are in the ecosystems, and for all of Missourians. So today we're going to be talking about climate resilience in Missouri, and just as an overview, so this is today we're going to be talking about a project that I carried out with the team that you just met. And specifically, we interviewed a bunch of decision makers and experts about climate resilience in rural Missouri. And so what we're going to be talking about today is those interviews that we had and some of the findings from those interviews. And then we'll also discuss an example of rural resilience that came up in Missouri. So we will start out naturally by talking about the climate in Missouri. And so I am not going to show any graphs associated with this, but we will drop in the chat some of the data sources where this came from. I'm just going to talk about the trends that we've seen over the last approximately 130 years. So Missouri has a network of weather observation stations across the state. We have about 180 in total, and they date back to the late 1800s. So we're able to see over 130 years how precipitation has changed and how temperature has changed. And some of the things that stand out is that our state is getting warmer. So the average temperature has increased, but just by about 1/2 to 1 degree over the state. But some of the more prominent warming that we are seeing is happening during non-summer months. So that means winters, springs, and falls are getting warmer. We're seeing that the maximum temperatures aren't really going up. So we're not getting more extreme hot weather like other parts in the country that are, but our minimum temperatures are going up. And so that often means our overnight temperatures are the temperatures that are going up. So it's not dropping down to as cool of a temperature overnight as it used to. Our growing season has extended. So the last frost in spring has moved earlier, and the final frost in the fall has moved later. So our growing season over the last 130 years has grown by about 11 days on average. And by the middle of the century, it's expected to have grown by about 3 weeks over that time span. And we're also seeing that Missouri is getting a lot wetter. And so that means more precipitation overall. And a lot of that is concentrated in the spring. So our springs are getting a lot wetter, which poses a lot of challenges for farmers who need to be able to operate equipment on their land. And it's hard to sow seeds whenever the ground is soaking wet. And then we're also seeing more extreme rainfall events, which also poses a lot of challenges like floods and erosion. And I want to stress that these are averages, and we're looking backwards at the last 130 years or so, and that it is very different by part of the state, just like it is very different by part of the country. So just because one part of the state might be getting a lot wetter, other parts of the state might be facing drought conditions at the same time. And these are not projections. There are some projections, and I think Brittany or Caleb will drop some information in the chat about looking forward. And the consensus looking forward is that Missouri will likely continue to get wetter, and it will likely continue to get warmer. So what does wetter and warmer mean for Missouri? Of course, it means more floods. We've already been seeing an increase in floods, including the flood that just happened a few years ago in 2019, which was the costliest flood that the state has faced here to date. We're seeing changing distributions of plants and animals. I'm really interested in this as an ecologist. I think about as temperatures go up and as precipitation patterns change, what does that mean for the ecosystems? Are they reassembling? And then this is also really important for agriculture as well, because as it gets warmer, some of the crops that we grow might not grow as well. For example, in a report that came out for the Missouri Soybean Association, they projected that by the middle of the century, Missouri was going to become a wheat growing state because the overnight temperatures would become too warm for corn to grow. So warm and wet also means that you will likely see an increase in fungal pathogens, because that's the kind of environment they face. So we'll likely see continued threat for farmers facing, disease and fungal pathogens. And then lastly, from these impacts, we are likely to see disproportionate impacts on the poorest communities in Missouri. So down at the bottom right, I cite a paper, and we can share this paper with you all later. It talks about areas of the country that have high flood risk, and it overlays that with areas that are especially socially vulnerable. And some of the hotspots that came out for the entire country were in St. Louis and in different rural parts of the state, where the poorest people live in areas that are most likely to flood. And so I want to stress here that as the climate is changing and getting warmer and wetter, it is already stressing our systems, our communities, our agricultural systems, our ecosystems, and all of these things have impacts on our economic systems. But to some degree, some of these impacts can be mediated by decision-making and preparation and resilience. So we're next going to talk about resilience, and this is a buzzword that's thrown around a lot, and in different disciplines, it has different meanings. But today we're going to talk about it in a very particular way, and it is this definition here. So resilience is the capacity of interconnected social, economic, and ecological systems to anticipate and cope with a hazardous event or trend, responding or reorganizing in ways that maintain their essential function and identity. And this definition is going to become important throughout this talk. So I really want to stress the different parts of it. So in particular, this part about interconnected social, economic, and ecological systems. Scholars from a wide range of disciplines talk about how the need for a business or a farm or a community, that it really needs to be balanced on these 3 points. It needs to be economically viable, ecologically sound, and socially just. And then we're going to talk about some of the action words here. So anticipate and cope with and respond to or reorganize a hazardous trend or a hazardous event. And the aim of it is to maintain essential function and identity. And so the scope of our project today is in rural Missouri. And so what you're seeing here is a map of rural Missouri, a population density map. So the red areas are the highest population, and the green areas are the lower population. And so looking at this map, it becomes very apparent that in thinking of the management of our natural resources, the management about the ecosystem services that I mentioned earlier, a lot of this is happening in the green areas of the state. About 97% of our state is rural. And so when we think about preparing communities or preparing a landscape for a changing climate, we're talking about it happening in these areas. And so it becomes really important how we manage these areas and how we use the land. And so that brings us to our research questions. And the first thing I want to point out is this wheel that you see right here. This was the framework for our research. This is coming from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration from the federal government. And this is just a 5-step iterative framework to be used by different kinds of groups, from researchers and communities to cities and states. And it has been used by a number of different kinds of organizations and levels of social organization. For example, Charleston, South Carolina used this in planning for resilience. The metropolitan area of Chicago used this framework in their planning for climate and climate resilience. And the state of North Carolina also adopted this framework and used this to try to become more resilient as a state. So really, this is just a way to get people together and talk about what are the major hazards, vulnerabilities, options, and then planning and taking action. And so our research questions are related to this framework. So the first question that we had for experts and decision makers in Missouri was, how do they think about resilience? So how are they thinking about this whole wheel in the context of climate change and in the context of rural Missouri? We wanted to know what they thought about as the prominent threats and what they thought made a system vulnerable, what components of a system made it vulnerable. And here, when we're talking about threats and talking about vulnerabilities, threats, we are thinking of them as external pressures, and vulnerabilities, we are thinking about internal characteristics of a system. And then we asked our experts and participants of interviews what concrete steps could help make rural Missouri more resilient. And so how we ended up finding our people was a mix of methods. We leveraged some personal and professional networks through the university, through Most Policy Initiative, to try to get an idea of who would be the people to talk to for the kinds of questions that we had, which were all centered around agriculture, conservation, natural resources, and land use at the state level. And for each person that was identified as we were interviewing them, we also asked them to identify other people who were important. So we ended up coming up with about 40 people in total that we sent emails to, and 23 of them responded. And so what we'll talk about today are a total of 23 different interviews. And 10 of those people came from nonprofit organizations, 6 were state level legislators, representatives, 4 came from state or federal agencies, and 3 were university faculty or researchers. And so here's a shot of all of the organizations, the nonprofits and the agencies that participated in the interview, minus the legislators and minus the folks that came from universities. So this is just the agencies and nonprofits. And you'll see here that we have a pretty wide range. We have 1 federal agency, NRCS through USDA, 3 state level agencies, MDC, DNR, and the Department of Ag, and then a wide range of different nonprofit organizations, from commodity groups and farming groups like Missouri Farmers Care, Pork Association, Farm Bureau, Missouri Soybeans Association, a hunting organization, Quail and Pheasants Forever, some energy-oriented nonprofits, and some environmentally oriented nonprofits. So a very ideologically diverse group of people. And all of the people that we interviewed are in leadership roles. So in one way or another, they are impacting the decision-making ecosystem at the state level. So we interviewed directors of organizations, deputy directors, legislative liaisons, state level coordinators, directors of research. And yeah. So for the next slide, we're going to get into some of the results of these interviews. And the first thing that I'll point out is our little wheel is down here on the bottom right, and this is going to be our placekeeper. So just as a reminder, we'll walk through the results in the same way I introduced the question. So the first thing we'll talk about is resilience. And I'm reminding everybody here of the definition. Again, the components of the definition are important. So the capacity of interconnected social, economic, and ecological systems to anticipate and cope with a hazardous event or trend, responding or reorganizing in ways that maintain essential function and identity. So we organized people's responses to the question in the context of climate change. What does resilience mean for you, or mean to you in your work in rural Missouri? And we categorized their responses by the components of this definition. And so we will get into this. Part of the richness of interview data is hearing what people have to say. So we'll walk through some of the responses, and I'll read some of the quotes that these folks talked about. So one person thought of resilience as the ability to maintain function or to a hazardous event. So if we have a really dry year, a drought year, can the crop still produce food? If we have an extremely wet year, again, can it still produce food? And you'll see U3 right there. The numbers are arbitrary and you don't need to pay attention to them, except to know that the same person would be speaking if it's the same letter and number combination. And then the U stands for university. So everybody is de-identified, so you don't know who said the quotes, but we do know from this that they came from the university. The other letters that will represent them will be A for agency, L for legislator, and N for nonprofit. So immediately what comes to mind is the ability to weather a challenge or to bounce back from said challenge. Another person thought of resilience as maintenance of identity. So resilience is all about identity, about maintaining identity in the face of disturbance. An agency person said that, or said, when I think of resilience, I think, can we help a producer or farmer, ranch owner, forest landowner be able to long-term handle the ups and downs and the climate instability? And are there ways that we can build a systems approach to help them ride out those ups and downs? And so one of the things that stood out to us that we were interested in is this idea of the different systems involved. And so we noticed that economic, ecological, and social systems across all of our participants were mentioned relatively equally. But they had a low level of interconnection. So people often didn't talk about them as interconnected systems together. They often talked about them as one or the other. And I do want to stress here that there are no right or wrong definitions of resilience. And during an interview, people are speaking off the cuff. And so these are the things that just come to them naturally during those interviews. But they still offer a bit of a snapshot of how people are thinking whenever we group them all together. So one of the other things that really stood out to us from the results of the resilience piece was that it seemed as though people thought of resilience much more as coping with or responding to hazardous events, and much less about anticipating or reorganizing for hazardous trends. But overall, they had a pretty diverse and well-rounded definitions and thoughts of resilience. So the next thing we will get into are the threats that people identified. And so as a reminder, our question here was, in the context of climate and climate change, what are the biggest threats facing rural Missouri? And so we will walk through these the same way that we walk through the resilience questions. So the first thing I will note from all of these responses is that people identified a lot of different threats, and a lot of them were identified just one time. For everything that was just identified one time, we ended up deleting it out because we're trying to get a sense of how everybody together are thinking about the major threats as well. And so what you're looking at has been filtered. We deleted about 20 items that were just mentioned once. But we are planning to develop this into a report and publish it, and we'll include all those details in that, and we'll keep you all abreast of when that happens, and we can share it with you if you want to see that information. So a few things stood out to us in the major threats. The first one is that people are indeed thinking of climate and changing weather. So they identify flooding, drought, changing precipitation, temperature. A nonprofit individual said on the flooding piece, that's a more immediate threat, and I feel like that's ramping up. And I think everybody's recognizing the more intense and more frequent weather patterns we're having. Another person said, you know, the old timers would say that the rains would come more gentle than they do now. We wouldn't get like 5 or 6 inches of rain as a common occurrence. People are also keen to point out other threats that rural Missouri is facing beyond just the climate threats. For example, one that came up time and time again was the idea of the consolidation of rural America and rural exodus. And so as technology advances and fewer people are needed on farm, more people move to urban areas. And so that leaves fewer people to steward the land and fewer people to farm. A legislator said, as technology on the farm gets better, it takes fewer people. When my dad operated this farm, we had 40 tractors and 40 families on the farm. Today, we're farming basically the same amount of ground and we have 4 families on the farm. And then another component of this is the changing demographics. One university individual said, you know, what is the average age of the farmer now? It's like 57, that's a problem. So not only are there fewer people, but the people who are farming the land are older. So people identified those as threats to the rural Missouri. And then similarly and related to that are these external pressures related to commodity markets. And so one person said, a lot of farmers have a system that's very dependent on using a lot of fertilizer. Well, this year, fertilizer product prices almost doubled. So people identified rising costs of inputs as a recurring threat. And a legislator said, the minute you can't get energy from Russia and the minute you can't get wheat from Ukraine, you start to see how badly that just screws up our economy. And we also noticed that in the threats category were some ideas that are in direct opposition to one another. Some people think of regulations as a threat. Some people think of deregulating as a threat. So a couple quotes here. They described climate smart agriculture as like an all of government approach. And honestly, to a lot of our farmers, that sounds pretty scary. They immediately think, what new regulations and mandates are going to be forced upon us? And you know, it's really frustrating from the ag sector because we're often blamed for all the problems and really don't seem to get credit for the number of things that we've been doing, for the things we've been doing for a number of years. And from the opposite perspective, when asked about what are the major threats for rural Missouri, the threat has come and gone and the threat has won. In my opinion, 40 to 45 years of deregulating the agriculture market to make sure there are no safeguards, no safety net, no backup for farmers to make a living has ruined agriculture in this country, and which has in turn ruined rural America. So this just showcases the diversity of thought that we have, that some people are thinking of items that are directly opposite as both threats. Overall, regarding threats, the climate-related threats that people did identify, they align with the climate projections. So projections suggest that Missouri is going to get wetter and it is going to get warmer, and people seem to think that those are the prominent threats facing rural Missouri. But also there's simultaneously a number of other threats like external pressures, commodity markets, et cetera, that are threats for rural Missouri. We are moving on to the vulnerabilities piece. And remember, threats are external pressures and vulnerabilities are internal characteristics of a system. And I will say, if anybody gets confused at any point in time and you want to stop me and ask a question, you are more than welcome to, if anything is confusing. So the way that we organize responses to vulnerabilities is slightly different than how we organize the responses to threats and resilience. And for our organization, we ended up using what is called the community capitals framework. And this is just a way to organize what people say into different kinds of categories. So for all communities or places, they have different kinds of assets. And so this is broken up by asset type or capital type, where natural capital is the environment. So you can think of the land, the plants and animals, river systems, et cetera. Political capital is the power to make decisions or access to the power to make decisions and rules. Social capital is the glue that ties communities together. So that's that connection between humans. Human capital, on the other hand, is relating to a person's skills, abilities, or knowledge, or their ability to access skills, ability, or knowledge. Things like leadership come into play. That is a human capital. Cultural capital is culture that ties us together. So you can think of things like art and music and festivals and heritage and things like that. Financial capital is the ability to access financial resources. And build capital is referring to infrastructure. So for all of the responses from people when we ask them, what are the components of a system that make it vulnerable? And what are the parts of rural Missouri that are vulnerable? We coded their responses according to this framework. And so this is the results from all 23 of our participants summed together. And so on the x-axis down here, you are looking at the different capitals that I just mentioned. And then this is the proportion of participants that attributed a vulnerability to that capital. So you can see the highest or the largest ranking vulnerability identified by people was human capital. So that would be referring to people's knowledge and people's skills, abilities, leadership capacity, etc. They identified that as the main vulnerability for rural Missouri. And so some quotes that are associated with that: having producers being able to identify that they need help. You know, a lot of people are like, I'm going to do it myself. I don't need help. I don't need anything like this. And they might be able to do it themselves and they might have the means to do it, but are they doing it the right way? And are they doing the resource justice? So this is relating to human capital because this is somebody's capacity to want help or to recognize that there might be a better way to do something. Somebody else identified that what makes most communities vulnerable is short-sightedness. And a university individual said, I think that part of our challenge in agriculture is that we tend to think, okay, it's a simple model. I put some fertilizer on the field, the corn grows, and I harvest the corn. But we know it's much more complex than that. There's a whole nutrient cycle that we're affecting, and then that has implications for the shrimp and fish in the Gulf of Mexico. So I think it's a challenge for our rural communities to see the bigger connectedness of our system, whether we're talking about the food system or the overall biosphere. So again, that's relating to human capital, the capacities and skills and knowledge of individuals. And I won't go through all these. I'll just talk about a little bit from human and natural, because those were the two prominent vulnerabilities that people cited. So one person talked about ecosystem fragmentation. I think the smaller the community, the more vulnerable it is. The more niche specialized it is, the more vulnerable it is. Another person talked about soil, and soil ended up becoming a recurring theme where a lot of people thought about soil and soil health and the importance of soil as a resource. And so this person says, marginal soil make parts of Missouri vulnerable, like parts of the Southwest Missouri or the Missouri Ozarks. The soils are very thin, and what little soil there was has often been eroded away. And then another item that came up time and time again, of course, is proximity to river systems with more frequent floods that we've already have and projections for flood frequency and intensity to increase. If you're in a floodplain, you're vulnerable. And so I know that this is a little bit different than some of the roundtables we have had before, and this is more like a presentation. But if anybody wants to discuss some of the findings up to this point, we would welcome some questions. And if not, I can keep calm and carry on.
Yeah, Zach, I've been responding to a few questions in the chat. I think you should feel free to just sponge on ahead.
Okay, sounds great. So the last step that we're going to talk about, we've explored how people think about resilience overall. What are the major threats that they see to rural Missouri? What are the major vulnerabilities of rural Missouri? And so the next question we asked was, what concrete steps could help make rural Missouri more resilient? And so the same with threats, we ended up dropping out everybody's response who said, or when a concrete step was just mentioned one time, we dropped it out. So this is all of people's responses that had more than one level of agreement, more than one person said it. So overall, there were 28 steps that were mentioned, but just one time. So that shows that there is a low level of agreement among everybody. But for these items, these were the 9 items that were mentioned more than once by the participants from our interview. So the top item that was mentioned the most by everybody is expanding existing programs. And this is programs like through the local soil and water conservation district or through USDA or through the Department of Conservation. They thought the programs that are in place are reasonably good, and that we, to make Missouri more resilient, just need to continue to invest in them, and especially try to expand them to reach other people. And that includes farmers who might not be interested in associating anything with the government, to reaching out to female landowners who haven't been involved in as many of the conversations. So the next 3 that were tied are landscape scale conservation, resilient energy grid, and then this idea of dismantling silos and encouraging systems thinking. So that we're not talking about silos on everybody's farms. We're talking about the kind of the institutional silos that we set up, where we think and act and plan according to one discipline or one domain. So that in that situation, so we think of agriculture as being very separate from conservation, which is very separate from natural resources. And so people thought a concrete step would be to try to think about how to encourage systems thinking across those domains. And then items that were mentioned 2 times are supporting value-added agriculture, legislation, and this was stuff that was either legislation that was in the works or ideas for legislation. The institutionalized monitoring was specifically referring to being able to monitor precipitation across the state, and setting up a network of soil moisture meters and water level data collection sites, so that we have a good idea as a state what kind of precipitation patterns we're facing. Then building shared language and priorities and broadband were also mentioned 2 times. Although in other contexts, broadband did come up a lot as being, people often thought about that as like the panacea to fix rural Missouri. So overall, there was low agreement. There were a lot of items that were just mentioned once, which again, once we publish this information, if you want to check those out, it will be in there. But here, just for simplicity and to catch the overall theme, we're just showing the ones that were mentioned, more than once. So we also coded solutions the way that our concrete steps, the same way that we did vulnerabilities. We were just interested to see how they lined up. So this is the same chart that I showed you earlier. And this is the same chart with concrete steps added in there, broken up by those domains. So a couple of the things that stood out to us were that human capital, which was cited as the most vulnerable part of rural Missouri, had a pretty low level of concrete steps associated with it. So people are thinking about fixing that problem through other ways than inside of that capital. And then likewise, institutional capital, which is the relationship of institutions and organizations to each other. So how organizations interact and get along, and agencies as well. And then also this relates to like the rules of governance associated with those institutions. So a lot of people thought of solutions as being within those domains. And another research question that we were really interested in knowing was especially as responses to some of the things that people mentioned about a place being vulnerable whenever people are thinking within silos and systems thinking being a concrete step. So we were interested to know in people's responses to resilience, if they identified resilience as being within a social domain or an economic domain or an ecological system, do they think about concrete steps differently? So a person who thinks about economics, what kinds of concrete steps do they think about? So on and so forth. And so what you're looking at here is a flow chart or a flow diagram or a Sankey diagram. And it is just relating the connections of one piece of information to another. And so on the left-hand side, these 4 boxes are if people identified resilience as being an economics system primarily, or in the context of economics, these are all of the solutions that they propose, or all of the concrete steps that they propose fall into these levels of categorization. And so what we found whenever we break it up this way is that when people think of resilience as being an interconnected system, so an interconnection, social, economic, and ecological, they think about potential concrete steps across all of the domains. Whereas people thinking of resilience primarily within the economics domain, they think of most of them, but they don't identify any potential concrete steps within natural capitals or within human capitals. Likewise, people thinking in social systems, they tend to leave out possible concrete steps in the political domain. And likewise with people thinking in ecological systems, they are not thinking in political domains. So these results suggest that when you have people from diverse systems and thinking about systems as being interconnected and interrelated, you have a broader range of possible solutions that cover all of the different kinds of capitals that are associated with a community or a place. So one thing that came up time and time again was is an example of resilience in Missouri that I wanted to highlight. And this is the Atchinson County Levee Setback. And so the figure that you are looking at here, this is an aerial view of northwestern Missouri. This is Nebraska over here. This is the Missouri River. And this is the very far northwestern corner of our state. And this white line that you see here along the river's edge, this is the levee that is containing the river. And so this is an aerial photo from early March 2019. And about a week later, the aerial view looks like this. And so what happened is the levee ended up failing, and floodwaters broke into into communities and into croplands. It ended up flooding out about over 50,000 acres of land, and the water stayed on the land for about 200 days. It impacted, it flooded out about 150 houses and forced hundreds of people to evacuate from the area. And this was not the first time that Atchinson County had faced levee breaks, and so this time around, they decided in rebuilding it that they would do something a little bit different. And I think that this is an example of resilience, and so I want to highlight here. They decided to set back the levee. So rather than repairing it in the same spot that it was, they decided to give the river more space so that when it floods again, it is less likely to crest over or to break the levee. And so what we're looking at here, this black line is the existing levee. That's what we just saw. And instead of repairing that, they opted to build a new levee, which is the yellow line that you see here. So that way, the next time the river floods, yeah, it will have more space. And what is interesting about this project is that it brought together a lot of different groups, and groups that are often thought of as disparate groups. So it brought together local agencies or local communities, state level agencies, federal level agencies, nonprofits. So the Department of Conservation was involved, the Department of Economic Development, the Department of Natural Resources, the Army Corps of Engineers, as well as the Nature Conservancy and the local levee district and soil and water conservation districts. So a lot of different people were involved, and a lot of different people from different kinds of systems thinking, focusing on social systems and economic systems and ecological systems. And this is an example of reorganizing for a hazardous trend rather than just responding to a hazardous event. So repairing the levee as it was, I think that would have been responding to a flood. And this is looking forward and anticipating what is going to happen next and trying to design systems that are more resilient to changing trends. And so this project ended up costing about $100 million in total, but that is just a fraction of what Missouri pays out every time there is a flood. And so it's not really a cost, but an investment for anticipating these events in the future. So the last piece I want to mention is as part of the concrete steps, we ask people what programs and policies are out there that you think could help rural Missourians, rural landowners become more resilient, whether that's their business, their farm, their forest, etc. And so here's a table of everybody's responses compiled. And there's a lot of tiny font and a lot of stuff here. You don't need to pay attention to everything. But one thing I want to point out is that levels, people are thinking across federal and state levels. And the two things that were identified the most, that had the most level of consensus, was a state level program. This is through the Soil and Water Conservation District, and then the federal programs through NRCS. And so the kinds of programs that people talked about through NRCS were the Conservation Reserve Program, Conservation Stewardship Program, as well as a lot of smaller programs like stream bank rehabilitation and planting hedgerows and things like that, where they will cost share with landowners to help them make their farms more biodiverse or more productive. And then the state level one is through something I didn't know about before starting this, which was this is funded through state tax dollars. And people mentioned the Soil and Water and Parks Conservation sales tax a number of times. So I thought it's worth sharing one of the quotes that came from somebody. So someone from a nonprofit said, "One thing that Missouri has done that is awesomely impressive that can't be replicated anywhere else in the United States is the 1/10 of 1% sales tax." So that's the sales tax we were just talking about. So for every $10 you spend in Missouri, 1 cent of that goes towards funding soil, water, and park conservation, soil and water conservation and parks. Is a huge boon for conservation and for all the recreation areas, the parks, the urban conservation areas. There's no other state like Missouri that has such a well-funded state option for that kind of assistance. And so that's where I'm saying, I think Missouri got it right. So this was originally developed in the late 70s or early 80s. It has to be voted on every 10 years. And for the last 40 years, we have seen overwhelming support. ranging from 65 to 75% approval every time this comes up for a vote. So what stands out to me is Missourians agree that maintaining our natural resources is a priority for everyone. So I will sum up some of the key findings and then we can open up for discussion. So key findings are, for the decision makers and experts that we talked to, their conceptualization of resilience is pretty robust and pretty well-rounded, but in general seem to be more oriented towards responding to and coping with hazardous events rather than anticipating hazardous trends. In general, people thought of threats, or the way they thought of threats, it aligns with climate projections, with it getting warmer and wetter and us facing more floods and more droughts. But they're also simultaneously balancing all these other threats to rural Missouri, such as consolidation of farm and rural exodus, et cetera. The most cited vulnerability in rural Missouri was human capital. So again, relating to people's education, ability to access education, leadership, et cetera. Participants identified a wide diversity of concrete steps, but also had some commonalities, and that's where I mentioned expanding existing programs, broadband development, landscape scale conservation, and a few others. We identified from this project that systems thinking, so being able to think across domains or pulling in partners that think across domains, is important for broadening the range of possible solutions for a problem. And also that both federal and state level programs and policies that are already out there are working, especially NRCS and DNR. And this could be an area to focus on for helping to develop more resilient spaces in Missouri. And yeah, with that, I would just like to thank MU and NSF for funding and supporting this, and Most Policy Initiative for hosting me. And then a huge thank you to everybody who was willing to speak with me and have conversations about this. It was a lot of fun to hear your thoughts during those interviews, and I welcome anyone's thoughts for discussion now.
Awesome, thanks, Zach. We do have a few questions that I would like to try to squeeze in. This one from Carol, I think, brings up a really important issue. She asked about yeah, so of the sample that we spoke to, which group of leaders represented underserved members of communities, sort of beyond farmer interests, and relatedly, which leader is sharing the voices of regular people?
So that is a good question. We did have one participant. So I think a lot of these organizations are working with folks in rural Missouri, and so one of the, I'm not sure what the demographic breakdown in rural Missouri is. I know that some of the most rural parts are some of the poorest parts. We did end up asking people if they thought, whether they thought people were missing from these conversations. And some people did identify that that women are missing from these conversations, that they should be more involved, and they're not involved. And one person identified that Black and brown people were left out of the conversations. Yeah, but I think that's an extremely important issue. That wasn't the focus of this research. I think that is definitely an area of focus for future research, and would be something, yeah, I think we'd be interested in exploring a little more.
Yeah, and thank you, Zach. Similarly, Jeff asks whether you're confident that the folks that we interacted with represent a cross section of views, and to clarify for Jeff, it wasn't a survey; it was a series of interviews.
Yeah, I think it does, and so part of this is we asked people to identify who was who are the linchpins and who are the most important for the decision-making ecosystem. So who is having an input on what's happening. And all of the groups that were interviewed were the things that people came up with. And through iterative interviews, more organizations were cited. It is certainly not exhaustive and certainly not comprehensive, but I think it does offer a reasonable snapshot that from perspectives of commodity groups and farming organizations to perspectives from environmental organizations and state agencies, as well as legislators and decision makers.
Yeah, I would just add that, none of this is statistically significant. This isn't a representative sample by any means. This is just very preliminary sort of exploratory work. So we set out to find, as Zach said, a snapshot, a cross section. So, interpret these results as such. And I think this is, the beginning of the conversation and not the definitive word on it. Some interesting comments in the chat about parallels to Indiana.
We are getting really close to the end of this discussion. Do we maybe want to take each of the panelists, maybe take 30 seconds or a minute just to, if there's one thing that our audience can take away from the project that we discussed today, what would that be? What do you want people to know? Let's start with Lauren.
Well, I wanted to go last. I just want to say, I think that it is possible for people to work together across these groups. I'm definitely someone who works in the science biology field, and I'm very insulated, and it's been a lot of fun even in this team working with folks that I don't normally work with. And I do think what we have to give ourselves credit for is how much extra work that does take, and that it's worth it, but it does take extra work to try to see each other's side and understand the language. So I think it's totally doable. It just takes a little extra time.
So I can go next. So I'm in a systems engineering department. And so I'm really excited about some of the insight here about trying to have more systems thinking and thinking about it from different perspectives. And so I wanted to share one little systems thinking trick that I think is kind of helpful and pretty easy. So it's called the 5 whys. And so basically the idea is that if you want to get at the root of a problem, and this can be really helpful if you're in a diverse team and trying to get everyone kind of thinking about things from different people's perspective, but you basically you sort of start with a problem and you ask why 5 times. And by the time you get to that 5th why, you're really getting pretty close if you haven't already to that root cause. And that can help get everyone on the same playing field and sort of thinking about it from the same sort of bottom layer of the iceberg. It's another systems ideas, trying to uncover the iceberg.
Yeah, that was a great tips and tools, Casey. Thank you. From my perspective, I think one thing that really stood out to me from delving into these interviews was just the extent to which there really is an appetite to delve into this kind of work across sectors and across the political spectrum. I think everyone we spoke to really loves rural Missouri, really is invested in its future. And we all have 100 different things coming at us, but I think if we can find ways to kind of step back and take some time to get to know each other, understand one another's priorities, that there really is a lot of common ground, and and we can leverage that going forward. Zach, I'll leave the last word to you.
Goodness. I just want to reiterate it was a lot of fun talking to all these people, and also that, as Caleb mentioned earlier, this is just scratching the surface and trying to get a very broad brushstroke idea of how players in the decision-making system are thinking in Missouri, hopefully to catalyze some more cooperation and some more work moving forward.
Wonderful. Thank you all for your amazing work on this project. It was so exciting to see how the interviews turned into that wonderful information. I have put a survey link in the chat. I just sent it again. If you're still on with us, as you're logging off, if you could click on that survey and let us know what parts of the roundtable you really liked and what we can do better next time. Also, this is a place where you can add in your email address. So once this gets published and we have more information to share, I know the research team would love to share with you. And so in that survey, you'll find a place to enter your information so we can stay connected. Thank you again to all of our panelists and to everybody who came to this roundtable. It was fantastic to see you, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.